G'day guys, Chronicles of Solid here and welcome back to another video. I hope you're all doing well. As you know, I'm looking for a new dual sport. I've put the Harley behind me up for sale, so I thought I'd do a video on my next dual sport motorcycle and the decision making process I go through in order to focus down on the bike I want to ride next. Now I thought this video would be helpful for myself just to solidify what I want, and I also thought it might be helpful for you guys out there, especially beginners, to see my decision making process and maybe help your decision making process in the future. So let's get into the video. The first step I usually take is being honest about myself, my ability, what kind of terrain I'm going to be riding in, my fitness level, as well as what kind of comfort I need out of a motorcycle. So I think that's the first step, is just to be realistic about your needs, wants, and your skill level. The second thing I'm considering in buying my next dual sport is the fit and the comfort of the motorcycle. Now I'm 180 centimeters tall, I'm also fairly skinny, so those things kind of determine what kind of motorcycle I'm going to end up with. Luckily, being 180 centimeters tall, that's about average height, so I don't need to worry about seat height or ground clearance, but I know that's important for some riders. A couple of guys in my group really value seat height as a major factor in their purchase because it makes them feel more confident and steady being able to get their feet on the ground when they're in challenging terrain. So that's something to think about. Comfort, as I said, is the other part of that and is a big deal for me. I have lots and lots of injuries from previous motorcycle crashes, so I like a smooth running engine and I don't like too much vibrations in the handlebars. The third thing I look at is my skill level. Now if you've watched any of my off-road videos, you know that I am not especially talented in riding off-road. I'm just your average Joe when it comes to riding a dual sport motorcycle. I tend to come off a lot. I do ride lots and lots of different types of terrain and I don't shy away from challenges, but I definitely don't have the more technical specific skills that you would find in an enduro rider or an MX rider. I'm just your average Joe. Being realistic about my skill level, I really am looking for something that can not only make me feel comfortable as I'm not a really good rider, so something that can complement my skill set, but also something that can grow with me. So a bike that's going to be good enough for me to develop those skills as I move forward. So that's the third thing that I think about when looking for this dual sport. Now, the fourth thing to look at is intended terrain. It's very important to be realistic with yourself about what kind of terrain you're riding. Now, for me, I tend to do a very large spread. Now it starts from commuting, so I use my dual sport day to day, maybe a couple of times a week just to run to the shops or down to wherever I'm heading. So it needs to be good at filtering, it needs to have enough pep to keep ahead of traffic, and it needs to have enough road manners to be comfortable to do that. Also, my most common riding off-road day trips with the guys, so that can involve highway riding to get to the off-road. I usually have to do about 50 kilometers of road riding, often at about 110 kilometers an hour to get to the trails. Then I do a lot of access roads to get to the trails, so a lot of just general dirt roads. And then I get into the harder stuff, so the four-wheel drive twin tracks, starting to get more technical. And we usually try and find some single track during the day if we're feeling brave. So I need a bike that can do a large spread of stuff because a single track does get very technical. And then the final thing I need is a bike that I can load up with gear, all my camping accessories, and do a multi-day trip. So that's a very large spectrum of riding that I do. Now, if you've got more money, you might be able to split that into 2 bikes or even 3 bikes. But I'm constrained with only being able to afford 1 bike to do this all. So now that we've identified the general things I'm looking for in a dual sport, it's time to focus down on the core criteria for my next motorcycle. The bike needs to weigh 135 kilos or less. The reason it needs to weigh 135 kilos or less is that the WR was 134 kilos, base weight wet. So once I'd modified that, it probably went up in weight. So that's why I'm looking for such a low weight, because I know I'm going to be putting modifications on this. I want to be able to pick this motorcycle up multiple times a day, because I tend to come off a lot because, as I said, my skills are mediocre. So when I'm pushing it in single track or even just on four-wheel drive tracks, I do tend to come off at least 3 to 5 times in a ride sometimes. So definitely weight is a major factor. So 135 kilos is the cutoff. The second thing is it needs to be a single cylinder. That's also because a single cylinder tends to be the lightest motorcycle available, and just I tend to like those characteristics the most off-road. So a single cylinder is a must. The next thing I'm looking for is a fuel injected motorcycle. I prefer the way a fuel injected motorcycle runs. It's not so much fuel injection is a better than carburetor statement, because I know some people really love carbs over fuel injection, and they definitely both have their place. But for me personally, I prefer a fuel injected bike, the more modern characteristics that that gives. So fuel injection is another thing that I need in my next motorcycle. So the next thing I'm looking for is 6 gears in my gearbox. I just prefer the way a 6 gear feels. I feel like the spread of gears, specifically on the road when I'm doing highway riding, I like that 6 gear overdrive for comfortable cruising at highway speeds when you're doing long distances on big trips. I also need a lot of ground clearance. Now, I'm not very good at log hopping, but I do come across some pretty big tree trunks. I also do some step ups and stuff when I can, and I'm always trying to develop my skills, so I'm trying to think ahead to the future. The WR250R really did have good ground clearance for a dual sport, so that's kind of the ballpark. I want that at least 11.5 to 12 inches or 300 millimeters of ground clearance. The next thing the bike needs to have is fairly decent suspension. Now, some dual sports tend to have entry-level suspension, and that really is their undoing. So basically, I'm looking for suspension that's at least capable of doing all the riding that I've identified. So it doesn't need to be the latest and greatest suspension that you might find on a 500 EXC or a WR450F, but it definitely does need to be capable suspension and not hold me back in developing my skills as I move forward. The bike also needs to have good aftermarket support, because I love to modify my bike. As you've seen in previous videos, I love to try and turn these dual sports into bikes that can really go long distances and do multi-day camps, and also survive really difficult single track, at least difficult single track for me. So a bike that has lots of accessories to tailor it to me, to make the bike better, but also the more accessories it has and the more availability, it tends to keep the cost down as well. So it needs to have a good aftermarket accessory availability. The next thing that's important for me is the motorcycle has to be low maintenance. I want it to be able to do at least a few thousand kilometers without having to change the oil. That's specifically because doing multi-day trips, I don't want to have to worry about stopping at a petrol station and potentially having to carry that oil with me and changing it on the trip. It's just another added burden onto what goes into doing a trip. There's lots of stuff you have to think about and concentrate on, so I don't want to have to worry about that on top of everything else. So it needs to be low maintenance for that, as well as it also keeps costs down just in maintaining the vehicles. The next thing I look at is value for money. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the cheapest bike, and it doesn't necessarily mean the most expensive bike. I'm just looking for a motorcycle that offers me the most for my money. So if it has great suspension and great parts on it, I'm willing to spend a little bit more if I'm getting that value for money. And likewise, I might look at a cheaper motorcycle if I can get that motorcycle and modify it and get the most value that way. So value for money is a very important consideration. And lastly, the final point, and maybe the most important, is the comfort of the bike. I need a smooth running single cylinder, and I need minimal vibrations through the bars, because of injuries I've sustained from successive motorcycle accidents. So now for the most exciting part of the video, what bikes I'm actually looking at considering all the stuff that I've gone through. At top of my list is obviously the WR250R. It's the obvious choice for me. I had one for years. I've absolutely loved the hell out of the little thing. It did everything I could have asked for, from crazy single track all the way to multi-day adventures. It did everything I could have asked for and more. It does have a few little problems. As I said, the rear suspension is not the greatest. The rebound particularly is quite pathetic. And it also does lack a little bit of grunt for highway use, but that is fixable to some degree. So the suspension can be fixed and you can gear down the bike a little bit to do the highway speeds loaded up without too much issue. So the WR is at the top of my list. So the second bike on the list is a Honda CRF450L. Obviously it's an enduro bike, so it's going to have a few issues maintenance wise compared to a typical dual sport, but the CRF450L seems to be as close as you can get a enduro to a dual sport motorcycle, and I think that's what Honda's aimed for. So it's got a lot of appealing things to me. It has very nice suspension, it's lightweight. It has a 450 motor, so it's going to have lots of nice torque. Now here in Australia we can get the 25 horsepower and the 40 horsepower version. So on road the 40 horsepower version really appeals to me because I'll be able to have a bit of fun. I'm quite confident with my road riding. Off-road the extra power really isn't all that appealing. I just don't have the skill to really make use of it. But it is nice to have that little bit of extra torque for chugging along off-road. Now the problem is that it is an enduro, so that means the service intervals are very small. 1,000 kilometers for the Honda, which is actually quite good for an enduro, but it's crap if you're thinking of like the WR250R has a 10,000 kilometer service interval for the oil. So it's going to be a bit of a problem in multi-day trips. And it does have me worried because that means I have to carry oil with me. It means I'll have to change it on the trip. It's going to be a bit of a pain. But if all those other things come together to make it a really great bike, it's something I may be willing to live with, and it's the reason why it's number 2 on the list. The third bike on the list is the DRZ400. Now, the S tends to appeal to me more because it does have a better subframe and it also is geared a little better for the road. I have ridden a DRZ in the past, and I have ridden with many different modified DRZs as well in group rides. I have a lot of respect for the bike, and I've put it on there just as kind of the wild card. I don't think this is the bike I'll end up with because when I did ride it, it did feel a little bit rough and the gearing wasn't great. Given I was on a DRZ400E, so that is the more off-road orientated enduro model of the two compared to the S, but it does have a massive accessory market. It is quite cheap. It is fairly light. That's probably the main reason I'm going to rule it out, is even the lighter E version is still a bit of a pig, and it also is carburetted. I know that's not really something I should cross the bike off for, but for me I like fuel injected personally, but it's not going to stop me from going and having another ride and considering the mighty DRZ. So that concludes this video. My top bikes are the WR250R as my number 1. Number 2 is the Honda CRF450L, although I am worried about that 1,000 kilometer oil change schedule. And third as a wild card is the DRZ400. Now I'm not sure if it'll be the E or the S yet, but it's definitely under consideration. Now what I'm going to do is I'll put a poll up in the video so that you guys can vote for the bike you think is best suited to my needs and that you would like to see me riding. I'd also like to ask you to comment down below if you think there's a bike that I've missed out or that I should be considering. So as always, I've been Chronicles of Solid, and I'll catch you in the next video. See you later.